In this video, you will gain insights into ways you can ensure to address the various assessment criteria that will be used to evaluate your final paper in EDUC 201. The idea is that you will work through this tutorial before you come to one of the 4 face-to-face out-of-class tutorials listed here. To sign up for one of these tutorials, ensure to reserve a space through Eventbrite. As with any assignment, I encourage you to go to the course outline and just review some of the specifics around the parameters of this assignment, along with the specific assessment criteria that will be used to evaluate your work. As with the first assignment, ensure you use 12-point Times New Roman or Arial font. Ensure your paper is double-spaced. Ensure you have at least 1-inch margins on the left and right side. And of course, ensure that you're accurately citing and referencing the various scholarly literature in APA 6. This will include a properly constructed reference list at the end. Again, also ensure that you have a cover page that includes your first and last name and, most importantly, your university ID number. As discussed in class, your final essay format should look something like this. It should have an introduction that introduces the reader to the context or issue that you'll be engaging in, a clear thesis statement, along with the main arguments you will use to back up and support your thesis statement. Your body paragraph can then engage each of your key arguments, where you can state your argument, explain it, and support it with research and insights from the literature. And finally, a conclusion that restates your thesis in a new way and also restates the main arguments you use to support your thesis. The first assessment criteria involves topic and thesis for 5 marks. The rubric states, essay has a clear stated and arguable thesis. Topic selected is related to course content, in this case a particular issue, and is appropriately narrow. We've already spent a lot of time in class going over this, and have created an opportunity for you to receive feedback on your thesis statement on a D2L discussion thread. But for additional support in crafting a strong thesis statement, I invite you to go through the thesis statement module posted on D2L. You can access this module by going to Table of Content, Assignment Support, and then clicking on Thesis Statement Educational Module. You can also go through the thesis statements along with my feedback posted on the D2L discussion thread. So once you've had time to take a moment to read some of your colleagues' thesis statements posted on the discussion thread on D2L along with my comments, I invite you to look back at some of the slides on writing a strong thesis statement shown in class. Once you've done this, take a moment to create a well-crafted thesis statement to bring with you to the out-of-class tutorial, and either Karen and I will then be able to give you some feedback to further strengthen and ensure you have a really strong thesis statement moving forward when you write your piece. A key way you can ensure that your selected topic is related to course content is to situate your argument within an educational issue or debate. Here are 2 examples from class lectures of what this could look like. Note this would come before your thesis statement. Educational jurisdictions around the world have introduced curricular initiatives that emphasize the need for students to engage in inquiry-based education. However, this curricular shift has been met with significant public opposition. In a similar way, after a meeting with the Edmonton Public School Board, veteran teacher Lindsay Dorville was fired for refusing to abide by his school's no-zero policy. This has brought forth important questions around the degree of autonomy teachers should have as professionals. In both cases, you could then insert your thesis statement outlining your position on this issue, and then in a separate sentence outline the 3 or so key arguments you will use to support your thesis. The second assessment criteria under the title of research states, the paper is thoroughly researched and the student uses the research effectively. The student uses the most current research available and draws upon literature in the field of education. To ensure you address this assessment criteria, I invite you to do the following. Draw on insights and research from a minimum of 6 peer-reviewed articles. So you can use non-peer-reviewed articles, but I invite you to ensure that you have a minimum of 6 peer-reviewed articles cited in your paper. Secondly, ensure chosen research, the research you choose, is current and clearly connects to and supports your thesis. So any research that is over the 10 years, I would like you to avoid. Try to use research that is a decade or newer. Finally, ensure to support each argument with insights, findings from the research literature, and we can look at ways you can do that. One of the most effective ways you can ensure your paper is thoroughly researched and uses the research effectively is to draw on the State, Explain, Support Framework, or what I call SES. So let's take a look at an example. Research demonstrates that a contemporary schooling context founded on the principles of traditional education possess endemically low levels of student engagement. So you see here I'm making a claim in the literature. It's a clearly stated claim and I'm citing it with two pieces of literature. I'm now going on to explain what I mean by that. In a study surveying more than 32,322 students in schools across Canada, researchers found that poor levels of engagement was a pervasive problem in educational jurisdictions across the country. So in this case, I'm drawing on only one piece of research because this is for the Canadian context. And now I'm going to conclude by supporting this key claim. In language arts and math, for instance, levels of intellectual engagement in grade 6 averaged close to 60% for girls, 55% for boys, but by grade 10 had dropped to less than 35% and 30% respectively. And you can see here, because I'm citing a statistic, I have to include the page number in my citation. All right, so you've seen an example of the SES framework, and we looked at this as well in assignment 1. So what I invite you to do now is take a moment to consider what key findings or insights from the research literature you will use in your paper. In general, you should have probably a minimum of 3 insights or findings directly quoted from an article, and ideally different articles in your paper. So what I invite you to do for the out-of-class tutorial is to work to fully develop one of these insights or findings using the SES, or State, Explain, Support framework. Now, in the last example, it was an empirical example. It was particular findings from a research study. So yours may be more theoretical in nature. It may be more of a key insight or an idea that a particular scholar believes to be true, and so your support could be more in the form of a quote from that scholar to support this key insight or finding. The third assessment criteria under the category of content states, the essay presents thoughtful and persuasive reasoning in support of the positions taken. The paper shows the writer's clear ability to use relevant theoretical approaches to understanding issues in education. I think there are 4 key ways you can address this criteria. Begin by ensuring you have 3 or 4 clear and strong arguments that clearly support your thesis. Now, this might seem obvious, but in some cases, some of the arguments may be tangential. They're not actually directly supporting your thesis. So I would begin by mapping these out, writing these down, and having a placeholder so you know that each one of these paragraphs is going to explore one of these key arguments that you're introducing in the introduction. The second thing I would say was draw your arguments from the research literature. So you're reading at least six peer-reviewed articles. They're going to present arguments within those articles, so draw from that. Okay? There's nothing better than drawing on arguments that are already in the research literature. Any key terms that you're using, make sure you define those. Okay? Even something like controversial issues. Give us a definition of a controversial issue, and that will show that you're drawing on relevant theoretical approaches from the literature. And then finally, I encourage you to engage arguments against your position with a counter argument. Here's a graphic that demonstrates what identifying 3 to 4 perceptive arguments from the literature to support your thesis can look like. Arguments are introduced in the introduction, and then each body paragraph takes up and elaborates upon a particular argument. If you map this out beforehand, you can ensure that each paragraph connects to and supports your principal or central argument as outlined in your thesis statement. As noted in the previous slide, there are 2 key ways you can effectively demonstrate a clear ability to use relevant theoretical approaches, or what we might call research, for understanding this issue. First, ensure to define key terms, ideas that are used in your thesis. For example, for the purposes of this paper, I define intellectual engagement as a serious emotional and cognitive investment in learning. So if there is a key idea or concept within your paper, ensure you define it with a quote from the literature. And in this case, I had a quotation, and I cited that correctly in APA 6. The second thing you can do to realize this assessment criteria is engage arguments against your position. For example, despite what critics say, guided approaches to inquiry do not stand in opposition to direct instruction, but rather seek to extend traditional approaches to education in ways that might support deeper understanding and more engaged learning. Now you'll note how I inserted that quote right within the sentence, so it flowed right in to my argument, thus making my argument stronger. So that is a lot to think about, but what I invite you to do is take a moment to write down the key arguments you will use to support your thesis, and as well consider one key argument that actually goes against or is in opposition to your position. For the out-of-class tutorial, I invite you to bring 3 key arguments in support of your thesis along with one counter-argument that you could more fully develop within your essay. The fourth assessment criteria under the category of organization involves a paper where organization is appropriate and contributes to a reader's understanding of the subject. Coherent and focused writing contribute to the overall quality of the paper. I think there are 2 key ways to score well in this area. First, use a topic sentence at the beginning of each paragraph to signal the theme and focus of the paragraph. This might sound overly simplistic and something out of Writing 101, but Karen and I were amazed at how many Assignment 1 papers did not have this. And as such, the thread of the argument became really hard to follow, and the student lost marks. So one way to do this, or an example of this, you could say something like, insights from the learning sciences suggest that one of the key reasons why discovery learning is so ineffective is the underlying assumption that learners are expected to rediscover insights that took humanity millennia to develop. So you can see here, if I'm critiquing discovery learning, I have a clear argument against it, and I'm articulating that argument right in the opening sentence. To further enhance the organization of your paper, I invite you to use transitions between arguments outlined in each of your body paragraphs. For example, you could say something like, another key reason policymakers are initiating shifts away from standardized approaches to education concerns, and then outline your second argument. So you've now identified the 3 or so key arguments you'll be using to support your thesis statement or the controlling idea for your paper. And what I would like you to do now is translate each argument into a topic sentence that could be used to begin 3 separate paragraphs. And using the example from the previous slide, I encourage you to use transitions to help connect your topic sentence back to your thesis statement. So you can bring these to the writing session and we can give you some feedback, and they will help organize paragraphs that you will write within your essay. Okay, so let's look at the final 2 assessment criteria and think about some ways that we can enhance these areas. So the 5th assessment criteria states writing is clear, concise, appropriate, and largely free of grammatical errors. The main advice I would give you here is to proofread your work, write it, take some time off, maybe sleep on it, come back to it, and reread it and correct some of the minor grammatical issues you might have had. A second way you can address this is have someone look it over and offer critical feedback, and then respond to that feedback. The final assessment criteria states all references are listed in one consistent style at the end of the paper. The writer cites all research in a consistent and scholarly way. So for the purposes of this paper, we're talking about APA 6. And I invite you to review one of the learning modules on D2L if you're still having struggles with APA. It can be found under Table of Contents, Assignment Support, and APA Module Simplified. And it goes through the whole APA process for you and will help with both your in-text citations along with your reference list. Finally, one of the industry standards, or one of the key places we look for insights around APA, can be found at the OWL Purdue site, and the URL is here, which I invite you to visit if you have questions. Throughout this presentation, I've been conscious of using APA properly, particularly in my in-text citations. So you can see here we have guided approaches to inquiry seek to extend traditional approaches to education in ways that might support deeper understandings and more engaged learning. And then I have Davis Samara Luce Kapla 2015, page 98, and you see where the periods are. Okay, so the period never goes within the quotation. It always comes at the end of the sentence after the bracket. Once I use Davis Samara, that first time I can go to et al. After that because I've named all the authors. Within your reference list, again, for peer-reviewed journal articles, there's a very specific format, and we'll be attending to this when we mark your paper. So I invite you just to revisit how to do a proper APA list, reference list before you submit your paper.